Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the School of Public Affairs. I'm Interim Dean Alison Jacknowitz, and we are thrilled to have you with us today. American University and the School of Public Affairs, or SPA, has a long history of hosting important speakers and events. One of these key conveners over time has been the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies, or CCPS. In 1979, CCPS was established within SPA by its founding director, James Berger, who is now a distinguished university professor emeritus and is with us today. Since its inception, CCPS has significantly enriched the intellectual life of both SPA and AU, while also fostering a deep understanding of government in the broader community. CCPS has organized over 300 conferences and forums on American politics, supported numerous researchers focused on Congress and the presidency, and published the esteemed academic journal Congress and the Presidency. Additionally, it offers certificate courses in campaign management and public advocacy, as well as a legislative study abroad program in Brussels. This event today marks the first public program of 2025 for CCPS, and it comes at a very critical time. Today, we turn our attention to the compelling issue of the federal budget and the processes that may be used to implement key elements of the Trump administration's agenda, both fiscal and otherwise. With rising spending pressures, expiring tax cuts, and the looming national debt ceiling, we find ourselves at a pivotal moment. Moreover, the majority party in Congress is intent on reducing spending while using the budget process itself to pursue its ambitious goals for the new administration. I am pleased to now turn the mic over to Professor Kahn, who, along with Ron Elving, the CCPS Acting Director, made today's event possible. Tom served for many years as the staff director of the House Budget Committee and is an expert in both the federal budget and the intricacies of congressional processes. Since joining AU, Tom has made invaluable contributions to SPA and the Department of Government, and we owe him much gratitude, along with Ron, for organizing today's program.
Thank you very, very much, Dean, for welcoming us, and thank you to all of you for coming. Again, I want to just express my personal appreciation and gratitude to Ron Elving, who's our distinguished director, without whom we would not be here, and worked a lot on this. And then, of course, Phil Smith, who's in the front row, who is with the Concord Coalition, and really is the engine behind so much of what goes on in the Concord Coalition, including teaching classes at American University we work with. As the Dean said, the budget affects virtually every aspect of our society, from defense to national to social security. And it has to have particular interest to students because it impacts things like climate change, education, and the budget determines not just spending, but also how much we borrow. And borrowing is something that should worry all of us, the national debt, the public debt. It's now $36 trillion with a T, and climbing up every day faster and faster. And it is in 3 years going to be the largest as a percentage of our economy in history. $36 trillion, even larger than World War II. But you know what the scariest thing is? We have no plan to control it. Not only do we have no plan to control it, we have plans only to increase it. And why should we care about the public debt? Well, the fact is it means higher interest rates, higher inflation, and eventually could cause a severe international debt crisis. And students should take a particular interest in it because, frankly, our generation is the one that made the mess, and you all are going to be the ones that are going to have to clean it up. Good luck. So 4 miles from here, just 4 miles from here, the new Congress and the new president are getting together, and they have plans, as the Dean said, to pass a large tax cut, the largest tax cut in American history, $5 trillion. They will pay for it in part by cutting programs that help the most vulnerable in our society, like seniors and kids. And they'll only pay for part of it because the rest they will add to the debt. So we obviously have a lot to talk about today, and we have an extraordinary panel of some of the leading experts in the country to walk us through it. First of all, Bob Bixby, who is the head of the Concord Coalition, is going to be our moderator. Shai Akabas is the managing director at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Okay, we'll put it, I'll put it on for Peter. At the Bipartisan Policy Center. Jessica Fulton is the vice president at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, and Gordon Gray, the executive director at the Pinpoint Policy Institute. So at this point, I would like to yield to the gentleman from New Hampshire, Mr. Bixby, for my time as you. Thank you, Bob.
All right, thank you very much. I think I need a mic.
You can take that.
Okay. I can grab this. Maybe I'll moderate from here so I can see everybody. That way it's, so I'm not like being here. Okay, so first of all, let me say it's really weird to be here because I graduated from school in 1977. Okay, so that was a while back. We're talking about honoring President Carter. I was a volunteer on his campaign as a public policy student when I was going to American University in 1975. So I come out of the garage and walk along I see all the buildings, and I haven't been here very much since then. And it was like awakening, like Rip Van Winkle or something. And I was like, oh wow. Okay, so, but I see Professor Thurber, and I know that I'm at American University. So thank you for being here, and for Ron and for Tom, thank you for being here, Phil Smith, the Concord Coalition, and thank you, Dean, for hosting us. The panel is called Navigating the Nation's Budget in Uncharted Waters, and Tom was talking a little bit about that because I just want to underscore how uncharted those waters are. The annual budget deficit is the shortfall between spending and revenues. And we like to talk about these things as a percentage of the economy. Gross domestic product, percentage of GDP. I apologize for using those terms, but it's how we measure these things. So, our budget deficits have, over the past 30 years, averaged about 3.8% of GDP. Right? They're now like around 6-7% of GDP and projected to average that over the next 30 years. So that's quite a shift. I mean, that's really uncharted territory for those of you in public finance, going from 3.5% of GDP to 6.5 or 7%. That's a really big deal. On the debt, the total debt, which is all these deficits added together, getting a total debt. That is, as Tom mentioned, it's about the same as it was at the end of World War II. Now, at the end of World War II, you could understand because we were having a existential threat against the world domination and big war. So I mean, you go into debt for something like that. Where we are now is, and Pam can talk about this, but I mean, there are a number of reasons. But it's a little bit more like we're doing this on autopilot now. And so the debt is rising. There's no particular reason, aside from policy choices or failure to make policy choices, why the debt should be so high relative to the size of the economy. And then just a couple of other points is that in these uncharted territories is that we're also dealing with an aging population. Now, that has two effects. One, it affects the budget because it affects things like Social Security and Medicare, programs that pay benefits to people who age. And as you have a rising population, those things grow on autopilot. It's not a matter of waste, fraud, and abuse, or Congress spending like drunken sailors or anything like that. You have a program in place and it pays checks to elderly people, and they get older and they get more checks, and it becomes more expensive. The other part of that is that an aging population can have an effect on the economy because more and more people are dropping out of the workforce, and we're not replacing ourselves. Our fertility rate has been going down. So you should be glad that people like Tom and I are still in the workforce, because, you know, a lot of baby boomers are retiring and, you know, collecting these benefits and everything. But that really, remember that it's like a whammy, because as, you know, costs are going up and you have a declining workforce, or, you know, it's not growing as fast as it should, it becomes more difficult for that economy to support the rising burden. That's a real policy dilemma that a lot of people don't pay attention to. So let me just, I'm going to turn to the panel in a minute and leave you with this thought that the budget is actually quite an exciting topic. Because everything has to go through the budget at some point. It doesn't matter what you're interested in on the spending side, on the policy side, or the revenue side. At some point or other, you got to talk about it, you know, in the budget. And that's why what's going to be happening in the next few weeks here in Washington is so important, because they're going to have a discussion about the budget. Okay.
We're going to talk about, you know, the budget, and that's why advertising is so important, because they're going to have a nice discussion.
That was so good.
Very well.
We're going to talk about,
Okay,
you know, the budget,
let me
that's
turn
why
back to the panel. Nothing like a moderator, but it's just
it's
monologue.
so important. That was so good. Let me turn back to the panel. Nothing like a moderator, it's just monologue.
This didn't happen when I was a student here, because microphones hadn't been invented.
This didn't happen when I was a student.
Okay. All right. So let me turn now to the panel. We have a situation coming up now where the Republicans have control of the House and Senate and the White House, and that means that they're going to get trying to enact a big agenda. Let me ask first, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the budget process, why should we care? I mean, why should we care that the budget is in uncharted territory with the debt rising on autopilot like this? Shai, let me begin with you.
Sure, thanks Bob, and thanks Dave for hosting us here today. Really appreciate it.
It's not working. It may not be you, it may be the technology. There it is.
There you go, Sean. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So I work at the Bipartisan Policy Center, which is a think tank. Our former president liked to call us a two tank. But we are one of the only organizations in town that works on trying to bring the two parties together around good policy. As many of you know, there are lots of forces pulling the two parties apart, and we are among the few that are trying to do the opposite. That is tough in a time like this, where it is unified government and Republicans are working to push through their agenda. But it is critically important for issues like fiscal policy, where what we've seen in the past, and Tom has lived through a lot of this, Bob has lived through a lot of this, just kind of Gordon as well, when one party is in power, they usually care about their own priorities more than they care about the debt. And then when the other party's in power, they care about the debt more than the other party's priorities. And what that means is that when you're in the minority and you have no power, you're raising concerns about fiscal policy and the problems that the majority's approach is going to pose for the country, but you don't really have the ability to do anything about it. And so what that leads to is more tax cuts, more spending that are driven by the party that's in control, and lots of concerns about the debt, but very little action, because the agenda of the majority party usually takes priority over fiscal policy. There are some of us lone voices out there that are trying to get us back on a better path, and it's really important for people to understand why this is happening and why you all should care about it. So why it's happening is in part because there's a desire for instant gratification among constituents and among politicians. So it's much easier to go to your constituents and say, I want to give you a new tax credit or a tax cut or this new spending program that's going to help your family or your business, than it is to tell people that you're going to raise their taxes or you're going to cut their benefits. That's pretty clear. And we see that from both parties. What's not as clear is how this impacts us over the long run. And for the coming generation, for you all, it affects us in ways that aren't always clear on a day-to-day basis. But that can be from the rates that we're paying on things like mortgages or the rates that we pay for housing. It can come in the form of an inability to deal with priorities that you all have as you enter the workforce, so whether that's student debt, whether that's compensation, whether that's housing, as I mentioned earlier. Immigration issues are largely tied to the budget as well. So because we're not dealing with the underlying fiscal problem, it creates an inability to create smart policy for the problems that we actually have. Climate change, of course, among them. And certainly we get bursts of progress on that, even notwithstanding the fact that we have these large budget challenges. So we had the climate law that was the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed by Democrats in the last Congress, but it's all too infrequent on progress on those issues because there's an underlying issue of the federal debt. And we really need to get out of this cycle where both parties are refusing to acknowledge that reality and get to a place where we are paying for the things that we want to do now so that it doesn't become a tax on future generations, which is all of you. Ultimately, if we continue to add up the debt, it is going to need to be paid back at some point, and that is directly going to mean raising taxes in the future, probably also cutting spending. So if we don't do it now, it's going to be for future generations.
Jessica?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me. I'm Jessica Fulton. I'm the Vice President of Policy at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. We're America's Black think tank. So my lens is always, how do we identify policy solutions that tear down structural barriers for Black people in the United States? And if I'm operating out of the economic lens that I operate from, that also means tearing down barriers for everybody, right? The way that I'm going to answer this question is a little bit less on the wonky side and more on the narrative side. I think that how we talk about the federal deficit and our growing debt can be really harmful because it can feed some narratives that are that lead to decision making that is not grounded in evidence, right? So when people think about government spending, they want to have a person to blame for who is causing us to run a deficit. Who are the people that are taking all our money, right? You don't really blame seniors. Like people can't. The narrative in the media, right? But the narrative in the media is not going to be like we are giving our money to people who are aging and need help to maintain their lifestyles. Not in the mainstream media, right? People are going to blame immigrants. People are going to blame people who are lower income. People are going to blame people of color. Anybody who does not look like me and does not think like me, I'm going to think those are the people that are taking my money, and so that can lead to some, I think, really challenging politics around the services that we know are essential for all of our lives. Things like healthcare, right? Things like investing in climate resiliency, right? Like things like giving supports for people who are dealing with emergency situations. If you think about the crisis in California right now, right? And so I think the part of the harm of the deficit continuing and the growing debt is that people just think that we can't afford the things that we all need to survive. I think the other piece is exactly to Shai's point. It prevents innovation. If we're spending time thinking about what we need to cut, and that is not to say that we shouldn't be aiming for like efficient services, but if we're spending time thinking about that, we're not spending time thinking about the new problems that we might need to solve, or the emerging problems that are facing all of us. We actually need to put really, really solid thinking into building solutions that are going to be helpful for, I think, for folks for decades to come. And I say that not saying that we don't need to address the deficits. I actually also think that some of the reasons that you mentioned affect more vulnerable communities more, right? If mortgage interest rates are going up, that makes it harder for people with less money to buy homes. And so, like, these are things that need to be top of mind for all of us, regardless of where we are, sort of politically or economically, right? Like, these are important challenges. So that's
Gordon. Thanks everyone for having me. I really appreciate this discussion. That's my hope is to have a discussion. I'm delighted that I'm joined by the panelists that I am, because I know that they're experts, and from what they've already said, there's very little in there for me to take issue with. I'm not unaware that I think my role here is to wear a red jersey and maybe speak to a different perspective than perhaps the shared on the panel. Honestly, I'm half a mind to take a chair here and put it a little further to my right. I work for what we call squishes and rhinos, and so I think in the current context, what that means is I at least acknowledge trade-offs in the formulation of public policy. And so why does this matter is for you all is it matters today, it matters for tomorrow. Working from today onwards is, I think, you all have lived through a period in time in which public policy and the federal budget mattered. We at once saw the leveraging of national capacity, our capacity to leverage our preeminent position in financial markets to borrow, to finance, a significant response to a generational challenge that was the pandemic. You also saw that capacity is not without risk. Public policy is not without trade-offs. There is such thing as too much spending in a given year. There are trade-offs. There are parameters. When you goose the economy past a certain limit, there are actually people who can wave a flag and say, wait a minute, there's a risk here. I'm not going to like what happens. Tell policymakers that there are risks to certain policies. Policymakers say, gee, thanks. Appreciate it. But I told these folks I was going to give them X, Y, and Z. And we have seen this under many, many iterations of unified and divided government. There are elements of every one of the signature legislative achievements under the last presidencies in my lifetime that reflect this. To the extent I'm supposed to wear a red jersey, I am incapable of pointing a finger wholly at those wearing blue jerseys. So I will let my team down on that front. And so we are living through an era in which a substantial share of the electorate, so this is the transition from today into the future, tomorrow, a substantial share of the electorate has been convinced that they can have more government than they're willing to pay for. That is, on its own, unsustainable. It is deeply gratifying in the near term. Both parties, successive administrations have leveraged this effectively. You can promise a level of taxation that is not wildly different from that which prevailed under the last 40 years. Much as progressive left likes to demonize the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it was going to be substantially extended under a Biden or Harris presidency. It was in their budget, unpaid for. Much as the Bush tax cuts were reviled, they became the Obama tax cuts substantially. Much like Republicans are accused of pushing Granny off the cliff for Medicare. They're perfectly content to expand unpaid for benefits under Part D of the Medicare drug plan. Why? Seniors really wanted it, and they vote. So a pox on everyone's house. There has been any number of conferences that I know I've been a part of. I know, all of you have been a part of them that tries to pick apart the last 20 years, the last 10 years. Whose fault is it? It really doesn't matter for you all. What matters is you're entering the workforce, facing a set of challenges on the budgetary front that will limit the ability of policymakers to continue to indulge in trade-off-free policymaking. Whether it's a programmatic expansion or tax cuts, whatever, to the extent that we are increasingly in a budgetarily constrained world, we have to acknowledge those trade-offs. You may think they're worth it. That's fine. But that needs to be increasingly part of the conversation. And I think we're entering into a world where those trade-offs are going to matter.
Thank you, Gordon. I think one of the squishers that you work for was John King.
Indeed.
Okay, I'd like to see somebody call him the squish to his face. Now, this is like going back, kind of with the same question with a little bit different focus, which is, okay, so if you were in charge, what would your budget priorities be? I mean, what do you think a good budget would look like in like 2 minutes each? I mean, not you obviously can't detail one budget, but I mean, what would your priorities be for the budget? Starting at Shai.
Sure. And Bob, I would just point out that Jessica and I came well prepared in our purple jerseys. Unprepared to represent the red team. One more stat that I forgot to mention at the top that I think will be really helpful to help people in this room understand the magnitude of the problem and why it matters. In 2021, 10 cents of every dollar that workers pay in taxes was going to interest on the federal debt. So that's just paying the people who we borrowed money from to keep borrowing money from them, not going to any productive use to help Americans across the country.
And by the way, it was more than Medicare or defense.
Well, so it was 10% in 2021. Last year, because the debt has gone up and because interest rates have gone up, that number is now 19%. Wow. So almost 1 out of every $5 that are getting paid in taxes are being used for no good use to benefit. Sorry, thanks. To benefit American workers, but just to pay that interest on the debt. And that's only going to grow in the future. It should be hugely concerning that we are throwing that much money effectively down the drain. When it comes to answering your question, Bob, around the priorities, there are so many it's hard to pick and choose and name them. But to Jessica's point, the more time that we spend worrying about the deficits and debt that we have built up and how we're going to address that, the less time that we can focus on the real challenges that are facing the country for the workforce, from an energy standpoint, from a healthcare standpoint, from a housing standpoint. I could go on and on and on and list them. We have a new commission at the Bipartisan Policy Center that's called the Commission on the American Workforce. And that's a narrow set of these issues, but I think our budgetary priorities should really be focusing on the American worker and thinking about how we can create a workforce for the future that is going to spur more economic growth, that's going to create jobs for all of you that are entering the workforce, thinking about things like AI, thinking about how we have workforce support, so things like paid family leave, affordable child care, so that when you have children, you can still continue working because you can afford to have somebody watching your children, how immigration fits into the workforce and filling the gaps that we have while making sure that they're not taking jobs that need to go to American workers. So there's so many issues that we could list, climate, of course, but until we get our arms around the underlying challenge, it's going to continue to be really hard to make those investments. And that's going to continue to be frustrating for everybody that is trying to argue for more funding for really worthwhile causes. So I met with a group that focuses on public health investment. Given what we just came out of over the last 3 or 4 years, that is arguably more important than it's ever been. That's going to continue to get underinvested, and it's in the part of the budget called discretionary spending, which is appropriated annually. That part has been shrinking because it's the only part Congress has been willing to put caps on. But it's not the part that's driving our problems. That's the entitlement programs and the lack of sufficient tax revenue coming into the government. So until we get our arms around the problem, we're going to keep underinvesting in the elements of the economy that are going to make it productive in the future.
Yeah, I would argue that I agree with almost everything, maybe everything. I didn't like check things off as you spoke. What Shai said, I think I would argue that we need to be thinking about using our budget to create opportunities for Americans. I believe that a large takeaway from this election was that people were concerned about kitchen table issues, like what they were able to afford, what they were able to, how much money they were bringing in, what they were able to afford. I would also argue that like maybe that's also about sort of how a system that I think should be working for me is or is not working for me, and how I perceive it may be working for other people who are not like me. But that's also because like I think about race a lot, so that's sort of top of mind. There was actually a Wall Street Journal article about some workers in a town near mine in southern Illinois where they talked about white workers being frustrated that the system, as factory workers, that the system was not working for them. And they saw black workers, not in their same industries, right? But they saw black households getting ahead. And that's largely because the system never really worked for black people. And so black folks have always kind of tried to figure out ways to get around it. I think making sure that our budget is investing in ways that everybody is able to access opportunity. That's about job creation. That's about figuring out some innovative ways to make sure that people have the kinds of high quality jobs that they need to make a living. That's about, I think, education at lower levels and higher ed. I think that's about, I mentioned climate resiliency. I think that's a huge place that we need to be investing. And also, there was a part of the Build Back Better package that was care infrastructure that actually did not make it through, right? So you're thinking about things like elder care and child care, paid family leave, like the things that allow people to go to work instead of having to spend time at home to care for the people in their lives that need somebody with them, majority of the time. So I think making those investments. I think there's also the revenue side. It is very important that we think about what we are doing as a society to collectively provide for the needs of our society. And I feel like that gets left out of this conversation intentionally much too often. We just have to deal with it.
Well, luckily I don't have to be too original on this question because I was part of an effort to, I think Shai was too, to answer this question more fulsomely about a year ago. We were asked to put together very much, if you could design a federal budget all on your own and have it scored professionally. It was 30 years, and what would that look like? And we've been a part of that effort for about a decade. So I did it 3 or 4. And I'll tell you what, they changed a lot over that 10 years, which is troubling because the budgetary outlook changed so much. Things that, and the policy landscape changes so much. Things that I would have thought were more contestable than otherwise fell off the table. The trade-offs that I had to make as a center-right policy observer changed substantially. I think when you look at the long-term budget outlook, the substantial drivers of our future deficits are Medicare and Social Security. They are growing well in excess of what any revenue base can sustain. They have and will continue to grow faster than what tax revenues can sustain. You have to deal with them. You can take all of the wealth from America's billionaires and run the government for about 9 months. You can tax them inexorably and raise a couple percentage points of GDP. We have baseline deficits that are 6% of GDP running to 9%. But we have some real challenges that none of the answers that would have been satisfying in the 2000s, even the 2010s, the stuff we used to fight about. I'm old enough to remember when we would fight about the difference between the top rate of 39.6 and 35%. It was a quaint era, 10 years ago. The world has changed, and our policy solutions need to change accordingly. So, when confronted with this question, what did we do? We went where the money was. And so that included our major health and retirement systems. That included tax reform. I use that word deliberately, tax reform. It's not tax cuts, it's not tax increases, it was tax reform. Policy design matters. It's not simply a lever that you can pull and money pours out of the magic money machine. How you pull that lever really matters. We have multiple streams of revenue. We have the individual tax code, we have the business tax code, payroll taxes. We have a much, much smaller portion of tax receipts that are collected from excise taxes and tariffs. As I think we're going to have been and will embark upon a interesting national debate as to which one of those buckets should we be drawing on for additional revenue. I think there are trade-offs that attend to some of those choices that are more damaging than others. I think that that dynamic should animate more of the 2017 extension debate that Congress is going to have. The legislation that will, or the title of the 2017 tax cuts that are up for extension are not the 2017 tax cuts in total. They are a portion of it. Candidly, they are probably less growth oriented than the package was as a whole. That included some elements like expensing of investment, et cetera, that are pretty good bangs for the buck. The upshot of this is just that policy design matters. So in crafting our budget, we were trying to be mindful that policy design can have important incentives for growth. So reform the tax code that can raise more revenue, do so efficiently, it's pro-growth. Reorient legacy programs, so health and retirement systems, or health and retirement programs, and hopefully provide a little bit more scope to do a couple things. One is invest more in the future, do the things that the founders would recognize as send a role for the federal government, and also create a little de-risk our federal budget. Just an analogy that comes to mind here is that I was trying to get here. Traffic was really bad from my office, so I planned ahead. I left a little earlier than I would have, but it was slower still. Sclerotic, kind of like our federal budget. We had impediments along the way. We had constraints, and I got to Nebraska Avenue, and there must have been 3 fire engines barreling down the street. Oh no. Where I used to have 10 minutes to get here, now all of a sudden it's going away. And I think about our federal budget in that way. At least I did in the car. What to say to y'all. But it actually seems like an apt metaphor, right? Because stuff like COVID. I'm sorry to say that I don't feel like the world is getting any safer. And so taking some risk out of the federal budget and our capacity to respond to emergencies, I think is a under-discussed aspect of the budget outlook and the budget situation.
What I was thinking, circling the campus, was how the heck do you get on the campus? I know I used to get on here somehow. Anyway, all right. So what there are a couple of things that I want to talk about. Get the panel's impression on. But I also want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. Because Gordon raised the tax cuts expiring, and that's the big driver of what's going on this year. Tax cuts were actually in 2017. Some of them are going to expire at the end of this year, and so Congress is going to have to do something about that. They don't have to, probably, and that's going to drive the debate on all sorts of things. So before we go to the audience questions, be thinking of your questions. Are the tax cuts, in the end, they're going to do some sort of a bill? Do you think they will be paid for? In other words, will they come up with other spending, will they come up with spending cuts or other revenue raisers so it doesn't make the deficit worse? And if they do it on the spending side, where are they going to go for the savings? Because they got to get about $4 trillion. Shai?
Sure.
So I guess just quickly to start, I would, building off what Gordon said, commend to you all a website called Federal Balancing Act.
It's a budget simulator where you can really see what
The government spends its money on and what it collects in taxes, and you can play around with it. And it's as close to anything in our world that I could call fun. So we're taking a quick look at it. It's been used around the country in high school, college classrooms, 100,000 users or something. So I think people have found it to be a useful tool, and the Concord Coalition has a similar simulator that can really help distill some of this in an easier to digest way. To answer your question, I think it's going to be very tough for Republicans to get this across the finish line. Their majorities, as all of you probably know, in the Congress are very slim, and they would need basically unanimity amongst their conference in order to pass it. That is really tough when you're dealing with bills that are this large, trillions of dollars with lots of policy details. So for example, many of you have probably read, there's a caucus that cares a lot about the state and local tax deduction, which allows you to deduct on your federal taxes the taxes that you pay into your state or local government. And these are from high tax states. Their constituents care a lot about that because they're impacted. So that's one caucus that they're going to have to deal with in the context of this very large bill. There's probably a dozen or more other ones like that that they're going to have to sort out if they want to get this passed. What could happen is that you might ultimately see that not be successful, and then they might come back to the table and start talking to Democrats about what to do about the expiring tax cuts. To answer Bob's question directly, no, I do not think they will be fully paid for. These are very large tax cuts that are, in any feasible political situation, very difficult to offset. I do think getting part of the way there, though, should be seen as an accomplishment because we have been very reluctant to pay for anything in the past that we've done. So at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we're putting out ideas both on the spending side and on the tax side that can help offset some of this. So you can cut taxes, but then also offset some of that by getting rid of some tax deductions and credits that really just shouldn't be there or aren't very efficient in the first place. So one example is, right now we give what's called a step-up in basis. So if somebody passes away and another person inherits their wealth, they get to only pay taxes when those assets are sold at the basis that they inherited them at. So if I buy a stock at $100 and then I pass away and it's now worth $1 million, the person who inherits that from me gets to take that $1 million and only pay taxes on whatever grows from there, meaning that the rest of it goes untaxed. That's just a huge loophole in the tax code, and I think whether or not that in particular will get closed under this this bill, there are lots like that could be looked at to make more efficient. That one's, I think, a particularly egregious one, but there are lots of deductions and credits that could be made more effective. So that's what we've been focused on at PPC, and we have a whole list of them as sort of options that are actually starting to get some attention on Capitol Hill, and I think that it will be partially paid for with those kinds of ideas, or on the spending side. Get into the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, at some point.
Jessica.
Yeah, I'll be very brief and say no, I do not believe that they will be paid for. I think that there will be some pretty intense and hopefully very thoughtful, but even this many days into the new Congress, it feels like there's a lot of just like noise happening, but hopefully very thoughtful conversations about where we do have opportunities to redesign policy or make cuts, or however we might address government spending. But I do not believe that they will be paid for.
I do not believe that they will be fully paid for. I believe that there's scope within the tax code for some base broadening. Talked a little. State and local tax deduction animated part of the last one. It will continue to do so. There are some other elements of the tax code that you could reform and raise revenue as part of a base broadening effort and maintain lower rates. As Shai mentioned, the majorities are incredibly slim. I think if you look at the 2017 tax bill, it was a more complicated bill, frankly, than this one will be. Nevertheless, I think if you looked at a lot of the happy talk in terms of the timeline back then, map it against some of the happy talk you're hearing now, that 2017 tax cuts were signed at the end of 2017. And I think that's somewhat instructive just on, it's going to be a bumpy ride for policymakers who want to stand. I think there's a third option that we hadn't really quite touched on, and I actually think would be among the worst options, which is they go through the effort, try to get the votes together to pay for a more permanent tax fix, and then halfway through don't have the votes, they spit the bit, give up, and just punt an extension for a couple years. And none of the hard work of doing changes to other policies that you might use to offset. You haven't done any of the hard work in terms of tax reform, and you've just punted a little bit. I have not been able to rule out that option, and I think that would be unfortunate.
That's looking like a very unfortunately likely option. So, not a whole lot of great news here, but let me go to the audience. Professor Thurber.
Okay, I'll be brief. I want to commend the Concord Coalition for years having a simulation on the budget, the federal budget challenge, and it was named something before that. I always use it in my policy class. I want to tell you the people on the far right and the far left came together eventually. Of course, there was a grade involved, and they began to understand each side, and they came together and came up with a solution. Now, if we could only get members of Congress to do that, to sit in a room and do that, it would be great. My question is this. We really have a gridlocked Congress. Both of you, all three of you talked about that. How in the world can they get reconciliation through and the debt limit bill through without the Democrats? And especially when the president, I don't think, quite understands the complexities of the process up there. The comment about the president last time was they got the tax bill through because he became uninterested in it, and the technical people on the and staff and others got together and got it done. There's a question in there.
Yeah, to your first point, it was remarkable. I don't believe there was an assistant secretary for tax policy in 2017, which seems obscure, but like that's the senior Treasury official who's actually the point person on tax, and I don't believe they'd actually had one in place when they were negotiating. So yeah, it was very much a congressional exercise, and that was part of how they made the sausage there. Today's whip count is not a majority, so I would agree with your proposition. It's going to be hard, and that's why I think I think there are enough outcomes where neither one sort of rises to the level of likely, but the highest likelihood to me is a rather unsatisfying outcome from a standpoint of public finance.
In May rather than in March.
I think we'll still be talking about this in May.
Yeah.
I would just quickly add as context for folks that what
Republicans will be using or attempting to use is called the reconciliation process. Some of you have probably heard some about that. It's been used many times before. But what that allows is for a 51 vote majority in the Senate instead of the usual 60 votes that you need to get onto legislation and pass legislation there. But what that comes with are restrictions around what you can include in the bill. So that will cause a lot of delays in terms of what's able to be included, what's not able to be included. Determining that in and of itself is a process. And so that will be a lot of the headlines that you read over the course of this year as they're trying to put that legislation together.
I got 3-4 questions. Yeah.
So I want to offer a couple of concrete suggestions for your criticism. One is pretty straightforward. Digital advertising is the biggest business in the country right now, and it pays almost absolutely no tax. It seems incredibly simple to administer to put a sales tax on digital advertising. If you wanted to get excited about it, instead of a flat sales tax, the more obnoxious, the more invasive the ad is, the higher the tax will. The second idea is more dangerous, admittedly, but when we were serious about deficits, we used a process called sequestration. And when the budget was out of balance, the spending side got cut, but the interest rates never got cut. So if you want the debt holders to have skin in the game, I would say you expose the interest payments to the same sequestration that you expose the spending to, so they get nicked a little.
Any reaction to those two ideas?
Quick reaction to the latter one. While it sounds interesting, I would be a little concerned about the impact that that would have on our ability to borrow, because I would think that people who are newly deciding to purchase that debt, if they thought that their interest rates were going to get cut, would then demand much higher interest rates from us at the beginning. And so it could have, unfortunately, a perverse effect. I get where you're coming from, but
Yeah, I agree with Shai. I think there'd be tremendous risk to. Would you be doing this sort of ex ante? So for the existing, debt issuances, or going forward for auctions, would you have some sort of a premium at exactly whatever that risk is? And
Good question. I hadn't really thought it through, but you won't know unless you try. And it might be.
There are lots of things like that.
It might be the holders of the debt would find the haircut so offensive that they would change their position on some of the spending issues.
I was going to respond to the piece about taxing digital advertising. I am a big fan of figuring out ways to broaden the places that we pull revenue from. This is not a concern about whether it would work. This is a concern about the politics of doing big tech in the United States is just incredibly politically powerful right now, and I imagine that there would be some challenges with getting that through. We can't get data privacy dealt with. We can't get content moderation and platform accountability dealt with. And these are things that are actually really damaging the fabric of our democracy right now. I can't imagine that that our elected officials are going to would be excited about targeting advertising dollars. I'm not saying it's a bad idea, though. I like it.
And I'll say, if you did have an equitable tax on it, you'd have more leverage on those other issues.
Absolutely.
Let's get another question for you.
I am of the impression, I'm not sure, that Bill Clinton was the last president who fully balanced the federal budget at one point in our history.
3 years.
3 years. And, coming from the red shirt team over here, there's been an assumption over the past 30 or 40 years that Democrats tend to be spendthrifts, spending a lot of money, and Republicans try to be more fiscally responsible. And with the rise of populism on both left and right parties, Tea Party populism is very different than modern Trumpist populism, but especially to Gordon, do you think that because of the rise of Trumpist populism, which seems much more focused on kind of bread and butter issues that are very hard to pay for, that the age of the Republicans being a more fiscally responsible party on the budget is, for the foreseeable future, over?
It's a great question. Let me step back once in characterizing the balanced budget of the 1990s. I know Tom has that.
He did it.
Personally. So
I did it too.
I was just saying it was a lovely moment in time. But I think the circumstances that gave rise to that moment in time are worth understanding. I think that are we allowed to say transitory anymore? I don't know. But there were transitory elements that animated that, where we had aberrantly high tax receipts thanks to an asset bubble known as the stock market, the 2000 late 90s stock market bubble that eventually imploded. You had a so-called peace dividend from the end of the Cold War that gave rise to some thinking on defense funding, created budgetary room. Talking about risk, I think there's a conversation about where that left readiness in the late 90s. You had favorable demographics. The composition of the federal budget was essentially completely flipped from what it is now, where a substantial share of what we were spending money on was that discretionary spending that Congress gets to spend every year. So these are federal agencies. Basically, you can pass laws in any given year to set those levels. Much closer to balance in the 90s, where Congress had a lot more control over what was going out the door in the federal government. Today, including interest, over 70% of what we spend money on is autopilot. Medicare, Social Security. Good luck touching those. To your point, Donald Trump told the American people you could have massive tax cuts, and the things that are driving most substantially the debt going forward, Medicare and Social Security, cannot be touched. It doesn't add up. So, to your point, I think that does introduce questions as to a given representative of a party's policy, but he has an opportunity to change these programs. I haven't seen his first budget. We'll wait and see.
We got at least two people. I want to get in all the questions. So, sir, back.
Sure. I actually was active in 1993 when it started, and we were saying all the same things. We knew there was going to be a big demographic problem, and we didn't deal with it. And the big message back then was, we better do it now because the pain is going to be so bad in the future. And I look at the percent of debt to GDP at 137, maybe 98%, depending on how you look at it, if it's publicly held or not. I never thought we could get there and actually still have a functioning economy like we do, and a growing economy. How bad can it actually get? I have 3 grandkids now. I'm not worried about my kids. They're doing pretty well. But, can we get to 200%? I heard Dick Cheney say, 20 years ago that, deficits don't matter. And I was just scared. That people, and I've been talking to some, I sail and go out with some economists, and some of these guys feel like deficits don't matter. So when do we get in trouble, and can we draw a picture of how this is going to happen? Are we not going to get back down to 2% right now because we have such a high debt we can't pay less than 5% to sell T-bonds or 10-year bonds with?
One of the problems is that there is no answer to that question.
I knew that. Yeah.
And so it's kind of like health things. If you can't say which is the donut that's going to clog your artery and give you a heart attack, or which is the cigarette that's finally going to do you in. It's a cumulative thing, and sometimes you're fine until you're not. And that's what worries me, is that there's not a crisis until there is one. And but I think you can, just like with health, you can look at things that are not healthy. And what the panelists have described, the numbers described, the CBO describes, is a situation that's just not healthy. And so, while you don't know exactly what the drop-dead point is, you do know that the current system is unsustainable. And it's getting, it is beginning to have more of an effect with the cause and interest rates and what that does to the budget, and as we were talking about, what it does to the general public. So, while we can't give an answer to that question precisely, that doesn't mean that everything's fine. I want to try to get in all of the people that have their hands up. So, okay, I've got 4 people with their hands up, so let's just do them quickly. You, sir.
You guys brought up the tax rate to how much reflecting something that used to be debt, which was I think around 20%, was it? But hasn't it in the past been like near 50%, especially in the 80s?
No, I don't think the amount that we're paying towards interest has ever been that high as a percentage of the revenue that we're collecting. I haven't gone back to look at whether 19% is an all-time, but I imagine it's at least pretty close, if not the actual high level. And the fact is that is projected to go ever higher. So the challenge becomes that when it gets too high, the investors will stop believing that we're going to be able to make good on all of our debt payments, and then they'll start charging much higher rates or just stop being willing to purchase our debt altogether. And that's when we get into real trouble, because then the markets are determining the policies that we're putting into place, not policymakers. They're just going to be reacting to what the markets are demanding that we do in order to be able to continue borrowing and paying our bills. that I think is the concern if we get into that situation. If that
Figure continues to rise.
One element of in the past when the share of the federal budget spent on interest was a lot higher. Or historically, there have been periods where it was comparable. I can't remember exactly, but circumstances were a little different. There were times in that history where interest rates were well north of 10%, knocking on 19. Like 10 years at what, 5%, which is relatively high in modernity or in the recent decades. But what is terrifying is that whereas you used to have a much, the times when we were spending a significant share of the federal budget on interest were very much a function of extraordinarily high interest rates. Now we have 5% interest rates, but our debt is so big that a little bit of interest on that goes a long, long way. And that to me is a novelty that is very, very
Okay, you sir.
I've been hearing a lot of red jersey rabble about cutting the Department of Education in order to help balance the budget. And in Congress yesterday, I heard Representative Schweikert say that cutting all salaries at the federal level would only equate to about 9 hours worth of running the government. So I was just wondering if anyone on the panel could maybe tell me more about this issue, the political efficacy, the budgetary effects of cutting the Department of Education.
Okay. Red jersey rubbish. Yeah. So we talked a little bit about this. Is that in the context of budgetary challenges, individual federal agencies are really not the problem. I would be delighted if this nation had a honest debate about education policy. I can't remember the last time we had an interesting national debate about education policy, right? Part of it is so much of the real education and education policy is done at state and local level. I think there's a lot of folks who look at what the Department of Education does and says, well, we could probably do without that to some extent. If you wiped it out tomorrow through legislation, you wouldn't materially alter the federal budget trajectory. A fair amount of those functions would devolve. So there'd be some money spent. You'd save some money, but going back to the earlier question about where should we focus our efforts, go where the money is, and that ain't the Department of Education.
I have a question for Jessica. You mentioned different economic barriers and how that affects your financing policies. I was wondering how that shapes the federal budget and how those play with other things that we discussed today.
Yeah, so
Could you repeat the question, please?
So she asked about how I think about economic barriers and how that affects different populations and how those factors shape the budget overall. I can give one example of working through in my mind, working through an example. Okay, so one thing that I think about quite a bit that in theory could be something that the federal government could decide to add to the budget in some way, right, is paid family leave. So if you are ever in any place that is not the United States and you mention that like people don't get a day off after they literally birth a human being, people like audibly gasp. They are very taken aback. We could decide in this country that not allowing people time to bond with their child after they have a baby is a problem, and is something that we want to invest in because we want parents to be able to stay in the workforce. We want we want the benefits of somebody being able to take care of their child when they're an infant. Like for that infant, as they get older, they actually are more productive human beings for society. They make more money. They pay more taxes. Like their benefits sort of down the line. We could say, as a federal government, this is something that's important. We'll maybe collect a little revenue, but we're going to make this investment because it's good for the economy, it's good for us in the long run. So like that's a kind of example. I think looking at places where we left people out of the benefits that we provide as a nation. You might think of Social Security, for example. We decided as a nation that we weren't going to include farm workers when Social Security was designed, because farm workers and domestic workers, because those were like largely Black people leaving with, you know, been enslaved, and like those were the occupations that Black people were doing during the time that we passed those bills. We could have decided just to include everybody, and we decided not to, even though we know that people are going to need support as they age, no matter what race they are, and especially if they're doing hard labor in their jobs. So like things like that are places where I think about investments for the federal budget.
I think we got one last question.
First, thank you guys for speaking to us today. You talked a little bit about the beginning about how policymakers and the majority want instant gratification and they don't necessarily focus on the budget. But is there any way to make them incentivize this? Like, how do you make them care? That's the first step if you can implement new changes.
It's a great question and something that many of us in the fiscal responsibility community have been struggling with for decades. What we've been trying to do at BPC in the past year or so is to try to provide policymakers with the tools to help their constituents understand how the debt will ultimately impact them. So the more that we can educate in that way how it affects interest rates and things like mortgages or the ability to invest in priorities that they care about, inflation, which we've of course experienced over the last few years, the better job that we can do allowing policymakers to tie that to the debt for their constituents, the more willingness I think there will be for addressing that problem. If it's just citing numbers like $36 trillion, which people don't really understand how that impacts them in their day-to-day lives, it's going to continue to be very difficult. I think regardless of what message we send, it's going to continue to be an uphill battle because it's much more difficult to explain how the debt impacts you than how a tax cut impacts you next year. But at least we can try if we relate it back to the issues that people care about most.
Both of y'all a question related to that?
Yeah, it's somewhat, I wanted to address hers, but
I'm curious because a lot of our elected officials that are currently making decisions in Congress have been there for a very long time. They have also overseen they've overseen this entire time, and I'm curious, you know, we don't work closely with elected officials on this specific question, but I'm curious about how they talk about and how they think about addressing this. Or like, they're obviously aware, right? But they've been making these decisions all along. And so like, I'm curious about targeting the folks who are maybe actually to blame for this.
That's a great question. Yeah, absolutely. So one interesting point is, particularly in the House, it's actually a much newer institution than was like the number of people that were around even in 2017 is actually a lot smaller than I had first thought. Particularly on the Tax Writing Committee, Ways and Means, a lot of new members. So I think for all of us that are in this public policy space, there's an obligation to some extent and also an opportunity to do a lot of public education for them and for their constituents because they need it. How do they sort of talk about it and think about it? I'll give sort of two answers or two. One is I was laughing when Shai was talking about because I've been in so many meetings over the years in this space with policymakers. Some of them were my boss at the time. How do we get people to care? So 36 trillion. How many? Shai, you've made this slide. All right, if that was pennies, how far would it go? If it was like we've all done this. I know Bob's been doing this forever. How do you get people to care? I don't know, right? Because we haven't succeeded. And you know, it rises at times to levels of national consideration, but ultimately, the sugar high of no, that's someone else's problem. I'm going to give you this tax cut, this program has sadly prevailed all too often. Individually, a lot of these members do care, and then you sit them down, and they're like, I want to be serious, and you sit them down, you explain to them that at the end of the day, they have to be the doctor who is telling the patient you have to diet and exercise. eat your veggies, go for a walk. For a nation that struggles with obesity, that message doesn't prevail all the time. That's what it is. It's hard. Eventually it's all diet and exercise. It's all downside. Nobody wants to campaign on tax hikes and spending cuts. That eventually becomes the prescription. They lose interest.
We're going to have to close here and bring Professor Elfing up. But I have a friend named Gene Sterling who wrote a book a couple of years ago called Dead Men Ruling. And his point was that so much of the federal budget is on autopilot that it almost doesn't matter when people come in whether they want to do something or not, because only about a third of the budget, the annual appropriations, which I refer to as the discretionary spending, goes through they have to look at it every year. The rest of it is on autopilot, as is the tax code. And there's a structural gap between the programs that are growing on autopilot because of our aging population and the taxes that don't keep up. And so remember that as you look at public policy here, that a lot of the budget is much more difficult to get at than you think. And Ron, let me thank you for inviting us, and let you close.
Well, thank you, Bob. I want to thank Bob and Shai and Jessica for everything they've told us. Obviously, they have one burden that they're asking politicians to bear of bringing bad news and telling people just how hard it's going to be to do anything about it. When I got to Washington, Ronald Reagan had just won a second term with 49 states and looked pretty formidable. He had come to office largely campaigning against the deficit and the debt, and it was at that time, I know you're not going to believe me, $1 trillion. And there was general agreement that it was going to be kind of hard to deal with that. But he, over the course of his presidency, did preside over a period of time in which it went up considerably. Efforts were made, certainly in the second term, to try to get arms around that and look at tax code, look at a lot of different things. But whenever there was an emergency or a pressure situation, both parties felt they had to do what they had to do in the short term. I don't know how to reverse that, but we need a personality at the presidential level. I can't see it coming out of the committees. But we need a personality or an idea or a method or in some sense or another possibly a media phenomenon that could make this real, that could dramatize this for people. But the travel from 1 trillion to 36 trillion has happened in just a few decades, really. And if we did it in that period of time, perhaps it's not inconceivable that in your lifetime you can take us in the other direction. And that's one of the reasons we're glad you're here at AU. And very glad that we had this many of these people give you this piece of your education about all this. And I know you'll take it in good directions. So thank you again to each of you very much for being with us. And thank you all for being here. Do appreciate it. Take care. Yeah.